Furman here from the Brett Furman Group. We're doing an interview via Zoom during Corona Crisis 2020 for the real estate show, Real Estate Matters. My guest today is Bill Dare, the owner of Spotlight Home Inspection, and we'll be talking about stucco issues. So, Bill, I'd like to turn it over to you and maybe introduce yourself if you would, and then I'm going to ask you some questions.
Sure. Thank you, Brett, for having me. It's exciting to be part of this today. It's a question that seems to plague a lot of owners and buyers and sellers, so it's a great topic. So we're really delighted to be part of it. The company that I own, Spotlight Home Inspection, is one of the largest stucco inspection companies in southeastern PA. We do a lot of property evaluations for building envelope. We do a lot of expert witness for lawyers and builders and consulting. So we cover pretty much the gamut when it comes to any kind of real estate transaction or building envelope problem. So, it's a great opportunity to be here to talk to you today about this, and I'm looking forward to sharing what I know.
Okay, so this is a hot topic, especially in our market area, southeastern Pennsylvania. The first question I was thinking about was, could you tell us a little bit about the different variations of stucco, and where does stone play into this mix in the problem areas?
Absolutely. So the stucco that we see the most problem with is traditional hard coat stucco. So it's basically cement on a wall over top of wood. Some of the older houses built in the 50s and 60s and maybe a little bit in the early 70s were block construction. There are a lot of ranchers and small capes and stuff that were block construction, and they have stucco over them. We're not worried about those at all because it's masonry over masonry, so you can't rot the wood. It's when we started putting stucco over top of wood, cement over top of wood, that we started to become problematic. So hard coat stucco over top of wood is what we're going to be discussing here today and what we see the most trouble with. So there is a different component to it, which is manufactured stone veneer. So that is basically what we call bumpy stucco. A lot of people call up and say, hey, we don't have any stucco in the house, but they have stone veneer. The problem is that stone veneer is applied to a stucco base, and it actually has more mass and it's not as smooth, so the water collects on it. So it can be more dynamic as far as collecting moisture. So the stone veneer is every bit as big a problem, if maybe sometimes more of a problem than stucco, because it's a sponge effect. So the more water it can hold against the house, the more potential damage it can have. So hard coat stucco is what we're predominantly seeing. There is a thing called EIFS, external installation finish system. There's not a lot of it around here. It was a big problem down in the Carolinas years ago. There's a few houses with it. That is where they put foam on the outside of the building, and then stucco, a thin coat of stucco on the top of it. That's considered a barrier system. And why that was so problematic is if water got behind it and it wasn't designed properly, which a lot of them weren't, the water couldn't get out. One of the better things about stucco itself is that even though the water can get into it relatively easily, it can also get out of it. So it does give off, and it's called a reservoir system. It takes on moisture and gives off moisture. So hard coat stucco is predominantly where we see the most problem. If you have an EIFS house, that's a whole different set of challenges. We test it more or less the same way. But so stucco is just basically a sidewalk on the wall.
So I guess that kind of leads to a question of, I've read and heard, and as a real estate broker, I see lots of stucco problems, if you will, that Pennsylvania is kind of considered like the epicenter of the stucco problems. Is that really true? And how big of a problem is stucco in southeastern Pennsylvania?
So we've been called by a guy by the name of Joe Seabrook, who's a PhD building envelope scientist, as the stucco capital of the world. So southeastern PA is the stucco capital of the world. So we do really have more stucco problems here than just about anywhere else. There are some places out in the Northeast where the weather is not dissimilar from ours that had some really big issues. And Canada had a lot of issues. A lot of the solutions that we employ today to overcome the deficiencies in stucco, or the problems that we have with stucco, they originated in Canada because the Canadian market went through this much earlier than we did and dealt with this. So it is truly a very large problem. not a single builder that I'm aware of, and I work for both builders and lawyers against builders. So I try to straddle that fence because to me, if it's broke, it's broke. And if it's not broke, it's not broke. So there's guys out there, there are people out there that'll tell you that the world's coming to an end when it's really not. And the lawyers like those people. But I like to work in the middle of that field. I love working with my builders and helping them get through these problems. And most builders, I will tell you, are really interested in doing the right thing. Certainly there are builders that are not interested in doing the right thing. And that's where the lawyers come in. And I do work for them as well as far as, preparing cases against builders. So it is a huge problem in southeastern PA. The genesis of it, or the logic behind it, is our weather is not great for stucco over wood. Okay. So we have hot and cold, we have lots of weather, we have rain. So the water goes onto the stucco, it gets held there. And over time, it can defeat the systems that behind it. I think it's important to also note that stucco is not ever and is not the protection from a moisture standpoint of the building. Okay. Stucco is just the pretty stuff. Okay. Everything that's important about that system for us is behind it. Flashing details, house wraps, and what we call water resistive barriers, the Tyvek, Typar, DuPont, all whatever the product they put behind it to get between the stucco and the wood to protect it. So that system is invisible to us. We're going to get a little bit into that in a minute when we can talk about how to test stucco, but that system we can't see, and it's ultimately strategic and very important that it functions. So yeah, we have huge problems in southeastern PA, New Jersey, northern Delaware, with failed stucco.
So really then, I guess the question really becomes, is there, someone that you can, point your finger at and say that, you know what, the problem is because the township codes aren't proper, or was it the manufacturer that didn't give the right instruction, or is it the contractor or builders that weren't trained or were trying to put houses up too quickly and just weren't really being checked by the municipalities? Is there any one area you'd say would be more responsible than another in this problem?
Wow. The answer is yes. They all share some responsibility in this field. The building code, let's start with that. Unfortunately for us, the building code is reactionary. It's not a leading document. It kind of looks at a problem and says, hey, this is really messed up. We got to fix this. So they write the code. Today, if you were doing a stucco project that we were involved in at any level, we don't do any stucco remediation. We just do evaluations. But if we were involved in it at any level, we would require you to put a drainage mat or a space between the stucco and the house. So most of them have like a 6 millimeter space. So the stucco is not tight against the house anymore, which was one of the biggest problems. We allowed the water to get blocked up back there. That still is not in the building code, even today. So it's going to be in the next code cycle, but Pennsylvania is historically slow at adopting the building code. We just now got IRC 2015 implemented. We were running on IRC 2009 for a long time. Every 3 years, they write a new code, but it has to be adopted by the state. So the building code is reactionary. It doesn't necessarily do a great job. I've seen plenty of houses built perfectly to code as far as the building envelope is concerned that failed miserably. And I've seen houses that weren't built to code, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, that didn't fail and worked actually pretty well. So the code is definitely not a great thing for us from a standpoint of, it's something that the lawyers like to use to go after builders that they didn't use this or they didn't do that exactly right. I'm more of a, hey, if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of guy. And if it works, and if it's been working for a long time, my expectation is going to continue to work. But the building code doesn't help. The builders, so the building boom that kicked off, you could arguably in the late 90s, early 2000s, created a dynamic where the builders really struggled to keep up with demand. They were selling them before they could finish them. And so a lot of things fell through the cracks at that point. 30 or 40 years ago, a builder had a plumber and he had an electrician and they were their employees and you've been my electrician forever. And if I've got a problem, you've got a problem kind of thing, and they'd work it out.
Right.
It became very industrialized. The cost of developing a piece of ground became so extreme that most of the small builders have really struggled over the last 15 years to do much of anything and make a good profit at it. So it became very industrialized. So it became more of a accountants and lawyers building houses. So, everything was put out to bid and nobody really worried so much about who did it. It's just, was it cheap enough that we could make more money?
Oh,
So it changed that. So the builders didn't help us any because we got into a situation where nobody was watching the hen house and it just kind of went sideways. Building materials are something that you didn't say. The building materials have changed substantially. Back in the old days, we used to use old growth plywood and things that held up really well to moisture. Then in the mid to late 90s, we started using oriented strand board behind stucco and siding. And oriented strand board is a great product if it's kept dry, but it will not tolerate much moisture. So it tends to deteriorate very rapidly. So the materials didn't help us. And then we went through this evolution of, well, what do we put between the stucco and the house? And we went from old felt paper, tar paper back in the old days. And then that tar paper became not so desirable. And we went to synthetics, and then they got lots of staples and holes, and that didn't work out too well. And so we've moved through these different types of materials that they put back behind her. So the materials have evolved over time. I'd say that today, done by a good contractor, stucco is a great product. I think that unfortunately it has become a lightning rod. And Brett, you're really familiar with, it's hard to sometimes sell a stucco house because everybody's like, oh my gosh, it's going to be a disaster. But it's a great product. It's reasonably fireproof. It's reasonably maintenance free. If it's done right, it holds up better than almost any other siding material. We were down at the Mayan ruins. They had 2,000-year-old stucco on the Mayan ruins down there. It's like, hey, if they can make it hold up for 2,000 years, what the heck? Why are we having all this trouble? It was on stones, but nonetheless. So the building materials have created challenges for us. And then we had to figure out that didn't work, and then they changed things, and then the ripple effect. And then the last piece of this puzzle that really has impacted what's happening in the walls of the house is we are building a very tight house now. We are trying to be very efficient in construction. And when we create that Ziploc bag and we don't let things breathe, which is great for our carbon footprint, but not great from a drying standpoint. So any water that gets in that wall, the heat doesn't transfer out. The moisture and air doesn't move through to dry it. So old houses, lots of BTUs went through the wall to dry it. Lots of air moved through the walls and it dried out. So we've challenged us to keep up with trying to figure out how do we conquer all those different moving pieces that challenge us. And we are going to build an even tighter house. The new building code requires the builders now to put a blower door test on and actually pull a vacuum and make sure that they don't have any leaks in that house. So we're building a house so tight that it's going to become even more challenging to control the humidity in the house and whatnot. So yeah, those are the things that create the challenges for us that make it difficult.
It's funny you mentioned the blower test and everything, because I recently sold my own house and it was a stucco house. And I remember they did the blower test when we bought it, but they also put on stucco. And of course, when I went to sell the house, I had to take all the stucco off and I switched it to a siding product, which kind of leads me to, in the age bracket of the various houses that I see typically with problems, I'm really only seeing them in what I call the newer variety construction. When I get into the homes that are, the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, and older, I rarely see any kind of issues. Is that typically what you'd find out there, Bill?
Absolutely. I think of it like a bell curve, right? So it's kind of like, not my grades. My grades are on the backside of the bell curve, but the bell curve is the epicenter of that whole thing is about 2005, give or take a year. Okay. So if you tell me you have a house built by a tract built builder and it's stucco all around and it was built in 2003, 4, 5, 6, or 7, I'm going to tell you that the probability is fairly high that there's an issue back there. Custom builders do a little bit better because they're usually on top of things a little more. They're watching a little bit better. But so it's not that you couldn't have a problem with something built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's just that they didn't use wood back then. A lot of those houses had a Celotex, like a rigid foam insulation behind there instead of wood, or they had Homosote, or they had exterior grade gypsum. drywall basically behind the stucco. So those things didn't rot away as bad. And back in the old days, before the home inspection industry and the stucco inspection industry became so prevalent, and we just really have exploded on the scene, you'd buy a house and your brother-in-law might look at it and you're hoping, you cross your fingers, you buy it, you know, and 15 years from now, you decide to put windows in the house and they pull the windows out and there's all this wood rot in the wall. And you're like, hey, look at all that wood rot in the wall. And you fix it. Or you put an addition on, you take the siding off. And so the things that would occur in the wall in older houses too, but nobody really knew it. So they didn't really worry about it. And then when they found it, they were already doing a construction project most of the time. So it's like, all right, we'll deal with this. The problem is that which is really started out with the EPIS. We talked about EPIS briefly. So it really pushed the envelope of the EPIS problems were huge in the South and like Carolinas and stuff. And we got pushed into a situation where the industry needed to find a way to figure out what's going on behind the walls. And so that process started years ago. And has evolved dramatically to the point now where we are extraordinarily good, not just Spotlight, but I mean, in general, the industry is extraordinarily good at determining what's happening behind the walls. And we needed to do that because the liability or the cost to fix this stuff is extraordinarily high. And so it's not like you bought a house and you figured out later that the guy missed the roof or the guy missed the water heater and it's $10,000 or it's $1,500. It's tens of thousands of dollars. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Barely a week goes by that I don't tell somebody that they've got to drop north of $100,000 to take care of their house. Now, not everyone is like that. The vast majority of them are smaller problems that are isolated in a couple of areas. But for the most part, the risk factor is extraordinary. So we need to be there for that. And great agents like yourself know that, and they counsel their clients to say, look, you cannot buy a stucco house or an all stucco or veneer stone house without having this evaluation done, because if you find out after the fact, the cost and the penalty could be extraordinarily high. So the timeframes basically are 2005-ish. We can have a house that's built brand new, and we've seen brand new houses just built in the last 2 years that are already having problems. You can't even believe that they could still screw them up, but they do. And I've seen houses built in the 60s and 70s that had some problems. Most of the older houses built before 95, the problems are very isolated. They're very much specific to a missing kick-out flashing or underneath of a door. And that really has less to do with the stucco and more to do with the door leaks or the kick-out flashing wasn't installed. So yeah, there is a time frame. Anything built in the 2000s is obviously a concern to us. You start getting back before 1995, it becomes less of a concern.
So when we're selling houses and we're going through the inspection process, and I'm watching when the clients are all doing stucco inspections, that's pretty much commonplace. There are a lot of companies that are relocating executives in our marketplace that kind of control the stucco house, because they're even enforcing it because they're concerned that if they move the executive from here and they end up moving back to Texas or wherever they're going to go, they don't want to buy the house if there's a stucco problem. So they're kind of controlling some of that process. So I guess I'm more curious in what's going on in the testing world, and like, are you still doing the penetrations with a moisture meter, and if it's 18% moisture, that's the magic answer? Do you look at more things than just the moisture? Are you looking at the kick-out flashings, for example, and the dissimilar materials for caulking and things like that, and the windows and how the roof kind of play? And how about the sill plates for the decks? I mean, is that still part of your stucco inspection process?
Absolutely. So I want to divide stucco inspections into two basic categories.
Okay.
First, I want to do a visual inspection, and any good home inspector should be doing those on a stucco house. You don't need a specialist to go in there and tell you whether kick-out flashings were installed or the ledger board flashing is under the deck, or looking in the rim board in the basement where you can get at it under doors to look for damage. Any good home inspector should be looking at those things. He should be telling you that the stucco wasn't installed correctly because of this, that, or the other thing. All the visual stuff should be done by a typical should and can be done by a typical home inspector. Once you have that physical evaluation, I call it, was it installed right? Although almost the universal answer to that is no. We do about 1,000 stucco inspections a year and another 1,000 or so home inspections a year. And I can honestly say in all those inspections, and certainly not all of them are stucco, but all the stucco inspections are stucco, very few are actually installed correctly. So it becomes more of a question to me, is it performing? And how old is the house? So if the house is 3 months old or a year old, I'm nervous. I'm going to be evaluating moisture. I'm going to be saying that that's really important. You brought up the percentages of moisture, so let me cover that real quick. So American Plywood Association, not Bill Dare, but American Plywood Association says that that wood in a normal functioning wall will be between 7% and 12% moisture content. That's completely normal. They also say that at about 20% or greater, you have conditions conducive for mold growth or wood rot. Now, this gets a little tricky because the meters are very accurate if you tell them a lot of information. And we're not going to tell them all that information because I don't know what species of wood the OSB is or the plywood is. I don't know what temperature it is. So if you do the high-low on that, it's about 2%. So if I get let's say I get an 18% reading in my meter, then if I did all the calculations and I knew all these things, it could be 2% higher or 2% lower, give or take. So we use 18% as our cutoff. And we say at 18% or greater, we have enough moisture in the wall that we're concerned. Now remember, we gave you 13, 14, 15, 16, 17% for margin of error for recent weather, for high humidity, for whatever. We gave away all that. And then the moisture meters go up to, our meters go up to 40%. 40% is saturated. Once you get above about 26, 27%, the water's so wet, the wood's so wet, the water drips out of it. But more importantly to me, in some levels, is what is the condition of the wood? What is the age of the house? If you're telling me that I'm testing a 20-year-old house and the recent weather was really stormy and I can't find any wood rot, but I did find an 18 and 19% moisture content. Right. I'm really questioning, well, okay, so what do we do with that data? Because it's wet, no question about it, but in 20 years and 15 years, it hasn't rotted the wood. And I don't like making the cure worse than a disease. Now, the bigger issue for you and I, Brett, is that we work for buyers a lot of the time, and nobody's more risk averse than buyers. So they just want to know what the guarantee is. And unfortunately, at that stage of the game, we don't have time to play around with, let's try this or try that and see if it, what happens to the moisture reading. Was it a fluke reading because of some, the guy the other day pressure washed his house, right? Just before we got there. So, I worry that changed it, but I didn't find rot. So rot to me, or deterioration in the stucco or in a substrate behind the stucco, is really a key component. Moisture actually plays an important role. And if you've got 23, 24, 25% of the wall, you're pretty well done. This is why we strongly suggest, if you're going to be putting a stucco or veneer stone house on the market, that you get it done in advance. So we have the opportunity to work with you to solve the problem, maybe without becoming so draconian that we're ripping all kinds of stucco off. Because I love buyers. I make a living on buyers, and buyers are great. But I've never seen a buyer take $10,000 for a $10,000 problem. They always want it fixed the best way, which is what I would do, right? You would do. We want it fixed the best way. We want assurances that it's going to be done and guaranteed. And the only way to do that is to rip the stucco off. So we get the opportunity to test in advance and work with the seller before it goes on the market. There's sometimes options. Sometimes it's a disaster and there's nothing we can do. So the older the house, the more confident I become that it's going to keep performing the way it does. It did.
What's your commentary on the thickness of the coat of stucco? And I see a lot of inspections where they're ½ inch and they recommend, almost an inch. And then the seller says, well, geez, it's fine. There's no moisture. I'm not doing anything about it. How do you deal with something like that?
Yeah, so that goes back to where I said, you got to evaluate how the system was installed, and rarely are they installed 100%. So I've seen systems that are installed 100% and failed miserably for whatever reason. And I've seen systems that weren't installed worth a hoot and worked just fine for 20, 30 years. So we're really kind of more concerned with the function of the system than the installation. Most stucco installations through the 2000s were ½ inch of stucco. Rarely do we see enough stucco. But it's not causing it to fail. It's just that it's not thick enough. Now you start getting much below a half an inch, we start worrying about too much moisture in the wire lath and other things. But half an inch of stucco, I see that several times a day.
Okay, and then is it something that you can wait on when, when you tell the client that, you know what, your moisture content's, 18, 19%, is it something they fix tomorrow? Can they say, I'm going to wait, let me give it 5 years and it's just going to get worse? Or what do you recommend in that case?
Excuse me. I think most people are really surprised to find out that my recommendation is to wait if they're not selling the house. There's no sense of urgency here. So let's get a better plan together. If you've got wood rot, you don't have a choice. You're going to have to be taking some stucco off the house. My threshold on that is once you get it past about 60% of the houses involved, then I say you might as well just consider taking all the stucco off and figuring something out. And you don't have to put stucco back on. I'd say the vast majority of people today if they're taking off a lot of stucco, they're putting back vinyl or cement board siding, and they're leaving stucco and stone on the front of the house. So it's got the curb appeal. Now you do have a lot of them have associations that dictate some of that. So you have to be careful, what that is. But if you have, 60, 70% of the house that's affected, you're going to get some economies of scale by taking the whole thing off. So I do think that it's like, because I've never been surprised by what I find how great something is if it gets ripped off. There's always seems to be additional stuff, additional drama, things like that. So we want to try to plan ahead.
I can speak from experience because I had to tear all the stucco off on my house, and I have to tell you, it was the vibrations and some of the other, the nail pops and the dirt and it's an abrasive process where you're clawing the stucco and pulling windows and but it's something that you have to do. But Bill, this was awesome. I really appreciate you spending time with us today to talk about stucco. Is there anything you want to maybe leave us with in terms of what you recommend to people that have stucco? Is it to go out and get an inspection before you even think about selling the house?
Absolutely. We want to definitely be in front of the information. The person with the information is the king, right? So get the information as soon as you can. Giving me 3 weeks between the time we look at the house and the time you list the house isn't really going to be helpful. I need 6 months or a year. So, and thermal imaging seems to come up a lot. It doesn't help us really with the exterior building envelope. I'm a level 1 thermographer. We've got expensive cameras in almost every truck, but it's not great for stucco. So, get out in front of the information and it'll be helpful, and work with somebody that really knows what they're doing, and they'll get you through the process.
Well, Bill, I really want to thank you. Again, I'm Brett Furman with Remax Classic. Bill with Spotlight Home Inspections. You've been very, very forthcoming. I'm sure the audience out there will love to get the information and learn all what they can do about stucco. And I'm very grateful. For further information for Bill, you can reach you on your website, which is www.spotlighthi.com. Correct, Bill?
That's correct.
Wonderful.
We actually have a video of a stucco inspection in progress. So there's one there. If you want to see what's done, that's where you can go look at it.
Awesome. Well, this was Real Estate Matters with Brett Furman. We're signing out now and hope to see you again with another real estate topic. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Brett.